welcome,
Thanks.
Dr. Allison Rank. Really pleased that you could join us for an episode of this podcast. For those of you who have not already met Dr. Rank, she joined our faculty, was it June, July
Yeah.
of 2025, and has already made enormous impact on the campus. And today we're going to ask her to talk a bit about student participation in the classroom. I will say that one of the wonderful things about having you here, Allison, is that you do combine deep understanding of the classroom, of the community, and of the research dimension of teaching and of civic engagement. So it's great to have all those. You're a Swiss Army knife in that sense. But today we'll be asking you to talk in particular about the classroom dimension. You have some experience bringing these things together. I wonder if you might speak maybe briefly about the All-In Campus Democracy Challenge.
Sure.
You received an award for this nationally.
Yeah, so the All-In Campus Democracy Challenge is it's a national project that's working on supporting campuses and having action plans around civic engagement for their campuses. It's entirely nonpartisan, of course, and focused on nonpartisan student voter turnout. So I will say they give awards to campuses as well as to individuals. And Panthers Vote here on this campus has won a number of awards from them, actually, for their work on voter engagement. For faculty, they do something called the Standout Faculty Award, and it basically is 1 to 2 faculty members in any given national election cycle, sort of looking at faculty that have done curricular work to make sort of a big impact on students' ability to engage in nonpartisan ways, thinking through questions connected to civics. And so the award that I won was for a program I created at SUNY Oswego called Vote Oswego, kind of the equivalent of Panthers Vote here, but it really focuses on students taking advantage of a nonpartisan voter engagement program on campus in order to learn how to engage in kind of grassroots organizing skills. And so that class for me is really about presenting students with a real life challenge, which is how are we going to run a nonpartisan campaign to get your sort of peers on campus who are interested in voting to understand the rules and regulations and to turn out to the polls, and then basically helping students run that campaign. And so I think it's my favorite participatory activity because it's a project where students get to try a lot of things and watch them fail and then try again. And I think that's actually one of the hardest things to build into coursework, where students can experience that participatory failure as a positive that they get to rectify, as opposed to a failure that negatively impacts their grade. And so it's actually been one of my favorite participatory activities.
Wonderful. So you're talking about students participating in their community. When we talk about student participation within a classroom, what changes? And why should we care about that? I mean, we can do a lot in the classroom in terms of delivering information, right? I mean,
sure.
What is
so I've
setting you up to tell us why we should
two answers, right? So I think there's the instructor answer, and then there's the civics hat answer. So as an instructor, I think that participatory activities are the space that we give students to take ownership over their education, to show us what it is that they understand, and I think to some degree, more importantly, how they understand whatever that content is that we've been delivering. And I think that it's also that place to kind of respond to colleagues, right? So whether it's responding directly to us and hopefully more frequently responding to their peers in the class, and that's the place that for me, I can usually get a better sense of teasing out where points of confusion, where points of disagreement, where tensions that can be both important as an instructor to correct, but really fun to dig into with a group of students. My civics hat answer is that one of the major challenges that we face today is the decline of people to live and work in community with one another, to sit down with a group of people and actually think through a challenge, or even before we get to thinking through a challenge, to sit down intentionally with a group of people and want to exist in community with them. And so to the degree that those are skills that people lack, building participatory activities intentionally into teaching is actually one of the key things that I think so many of us can do to help to rebuild some of the fabric of our civic culture.
Well, I loved when you said fun to dig into.
Yeah.
and I'm not sure that's the students' first response to the request to engage a problem or engage with each other even. So what do you see as the challenges to get students to the place where they say, yeah, this is fun, I'm in?
Yeah. So I think there are challenges that are different for faculty or the instructor and challenges that are specific to the students. And so if I'm thinking about sort of the challenges or the resistance that students have, again, sort of you can take the political scientist out of the classroom, but I'm a political scientist when I think about being in a classroom. And so I think about institutional conditions that our students come in with in terms of what's causing their resistance or the challenge. And so increasingly, our students live polarized lives. They're in communities where people are largely sorted by partisan affiliation or political ideology. When they get to a college campus, it is likely to be one of the first times that they've been around a lot of people with distinct viewpoints from what they are accustomed to in their community. And so institutionally, the environment of a college classroom is something that's really challenging for students to think about having a conversation in to start with. I think the second institutional condition is just the role of technology. When I was in undergrad, and I'm a pretty introverted person, you got to know the people sitting around you because it was so boring to just sit in your classroom for 10 minutes before class started. And so you'd make some kind of small talk with some people. I don't know how other people's classrooms are, but I walk in and they're all on their phones. And so sort of, again, that institutional sort of structure around them does not encourage that sort of even having the baseline relationships with other people in class that can help make conversations or participating seem less challenging. And then the third institutional fact is that we've been really clear over the last number of years that in communicating to students that college is about career readiness. And I absolutely think that participatory skills are a massive part of career readiness, but I think that's a harder sell for students. Knowledge acquisition, I think, makes sense to students as career readiness. And so between being in an environment that feels confronting in a way, technology sort of contributing to a lack of those natural building of social connections in the classroom, and then a challenge to actually see participation as part of sort of what they're at college to learn to do, I think make things really challenging for students.
And maybe the mode of participation, students may be actively engaged with a host of people, but it's through a digital technology interface versus that conversational physical presence in a classroom.
Physical presence, and I think when you are for the most part, when you're in a digital space, you have a great deal of control over simply disappearing from that interaction that you don't, or I would say shouldn't have, when you're sitting in the classroom. And so the embodiment of being in a participatory space where you're going to look somebody in the face and say out loud something that you think, and then sit in whatever the experience is of their reaction to what you've said, is very different than doing that in a digital space.
As you described that, I realized that the comfort zone that I've created in the classroom is very specific to the classroom, and other communities, I would not necessarily feel that same readiness. So it's a good reminder for us introverts. For we introverts, let's get a check on the grammar. Wilson will edit something in there. So I think you've talked about the challenges, the risks, student resistance.
I guess student resistance, yeah.
Yeah. So what can we do? What can students do what are some strategies and roles that you would suggest, recommend for everybody in the room?
Sure. So I think there are risks for faculty in this or for instructors in this. And so I think the first thing is actually just thinking through as an instructor, what is your comfort level with different kinds of conversations, right? What would it mean to create participatory opportunities in your classroom? And once you've done that kind of work around your discipline, your pedagogical style for what kind of participation makes sense for you, then I really think it is about figuring out how to scaffold work that responds to those particular challenges. I've really tried to get specific about thinking about participation in class as something that I have a responsibility to scaffold the same way I should scaffold students' writing skills. That if part of what's happening is that we have a loss of civic culture, we have a loss of sort of comfort being in community with one another and kind of what that means and the kinds of discomforts that it can produce, as well as the kinds of absolute flashes of brilliance that it can produce, then I have a responsibility to help walk students through that the same way I have a responsibility to help them work from a research question to an annotated bibliography to a lit review to a research paper. And so just a couple of the ways that I've thought about this, and I'd be curious from the perspective of somebody who's taught music how this might work for you, is I think about how to integrate relationship building activities in my classes to essentially substitute for that 10 minutes before class starts that I need them to have, right? Like, how do I do a set of things in class that actually ask incredibly dumb questions, Star Wars versus Star Trek, where can I get the best chicken sandwich, that just get students to engage in a way that raises some awareness for everybody else of who's in the room, gets a little bit of a laugh, gets a little bit of comfort and familiarity built before I dive into, can we talk about Doge, right? Like, how can I actually bring some of that relationship building in intentionally, which again, as an introvert, is not my favorite thing that I've had to learn how to do, but I think it's really important. The second piece, and this is one where I'm really curious how other disciplines would handle this, is I focus a lot on providing students with what I refer to as proxies. So if one of the challenges that I think students have is sitting in a room with other folks and saying, particularly if it's challenging to directly echo someone else's point, is to actually say, I think X, here's why I think it, and then sit and wait and see what other people say. That sort of the risk that's inherent in doing that, I think, is really heightened for students in a contemporary context. And so I like to do something I refer to as creating proxies. And so how can I provide, in political science, for example, I'll provide op-eds or pieces of scholarship from 3 different people from 3 different perspectives, ideally none of which map neatly onto a sort of Republican-Democrat space, and then ask students to align themselves with which one of those 3 pieces most closely represents their viewpoint, and then make an argument from there. And in that way, they essentially get to offload sort of some level of ownership for articulating the original idea. And then it just becomes about explaining what's appealing about it or why you think it makes sense. But they didn't have to do that original articulation. Once they get more comfortable with that, then it can move into kind of, okay, I've created 4 positions. We're going to do a fishbowl exercise where one person from each of the 4 is going to sit in the middle and have that conversation. And so again, it's that scaffolding, moving from relationship scaffolding to then sort of idea generation scaffolding, and then moving all the way into actually articulating your own viewpoint, kind of quote from scratch from the materials from class.
So that middle point is built around a protocol for their interaction
Exactly.
that helps them separate somewhat from the anxiety of when do I talk and what am I allowed to say?
So when do I talk, but definitely the what am I allowed to say? So one of the things that I always try to keep in mind is that our students are absolutely rational actors. They understand the incentive structure of the contemporary environment. And that incentive structure sort of disincentivizes going out on a limb. It recognizes that if you say something and a large number of your social network objects to it, the consequences can be steep and they can be sudden. That things that are said in the classroom will not stay in the classroom, right? All of these pieces are really rational reasons for students to be hesitant to put their own viewpoints forward. And so for me, sort of providing proxies is in some ways a kind of training wheels way of saying, like, all of these are opinions that are 100% on the table. So let's have a debate about which ones of these you guys think make the most sense for you and why. And once that becomes more comfortable, we can move to the next stage.
You asked about music.
Yeah.
So two little vignettes. One would be, and I think this just shows what a sliding scale it is, depending on the context that you've been talking about. If I'm teaching a class of majors and it's an applied instruction, in other words, everybody has an instrument in their hands. Number one, that community of majors existed before this particular grouping for my class was formed. So they know each other, and conversation is likely to be already going. Plus, you can't hold a cell phone and a cello at the same time. It's complicated. So it displaces those things. On the other hand, so that would have one set of responsibilities from me as a teacher. But if I walk into a gen ed class of 60 who are studying what we have called music appreciation, there I think I'm more inclined to validate their musical selves that they brought to class to begin with, rather than emphasize that everybody comes in as a newbie. Music can be intimidating to those that are not practicing it. But if we have an assignment like introduce yourself to the class with your walk-up song, and it gives them the chance to talk about a piece they might have chosen, and their enthusiasm for that music is more relevant than anything I could say at that time about them, about their relationship with music.
So I'm going to steal the walk-up song and add it to my repertoire. So I like to let, in that range of what are the low-stakes kind of conversations we can have to build community, that would fit really well in that, where it would spark right? It's like suddenly a couple students are having a conversation about something, and inevitably I start getting mocked because I don't have any idea what music it is that they're talking about, and I'm happy if that's how they choose to bond in my class to build relationships with one another, is my lack of knowledge of the things that they listen to or watch. The other one I found that works really well for that situation is, what's your favorite vending machine snack? Which will create much deeper debates than I ever anticipated at the start of a class for 5 minutes.
Best not ask that in an 11 o'clock class. But
yeah. It's good at a 3 o'clock in the afternoon class, though. It rolls.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm looking at our train of thought here that we've kind of mapped out, but I think you've gotten to discuss some of these roles and strategies in the protocols and the
I think so. I think the one other strategy that I would note that I've started using and have found helpful is that I think one of the perennial challenges of participation is, how do you assess it? Right? Like that's always, I don't want to assess, did your body physically come to class, for all sorts of reasons. I don't want to assess, did you just speak up 1 or 2 times? Or there are all sorts of, I think, reliability questions and accessibility questions about how we assess. And so one of the things I actually started doing was creating fairly specific question sets for preparing for an in-class conversation and then reflecting on an in-class conversation. And that's now what I assess in terms of students' participation. And I found that to actually be really helpful, again, because it creates some of that scaffolding in terms of if this is a time when I'm not going to give you proxies, you've got to come in ready to make a point. Here's a way to think about preparing for that conversation. And then the reflection piece essentially requires them to be able to think through, how did somebody respond to you? How did that make you feel? Did it shift what you think at all? If why, how? If not, sort of what was your response to them in the conversation? If you didn't give the response in the conversation, why didn't you? And I think having that kind of structure, again, makes me feel better about the amount of emphasis I place on this in classes, because it does have some kind of assessment attached to it, and it helps ensure that students get some active feedback about an important skill that otherwise can be somewhat ephemeral for them.
This sounds like the kind of thing you would put on lather, rinse, repeat, so that they would get multiple chances to try this.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than changing the rules for the next
Right.
classroom.
Yeah.
Great. Well, are there things that in our best intentions as instructors go wrong? Are there ways that we may shoot ourselves in the foot as we're trying to create the environment for these conversations in class?
I will say the one place that I have gone wrong the most frequently is assuming that the students will be excited about a thing that I am excited about. So I think that instructor excitement and enthusiasm absolutely matters in a classroom. And yet, if I walk in armed with the questions that made me excited about a reading, that conversation will almost always flop, because those questions are not pitched for students to engage in them. And so that actually took me a while when I started teaching to figure out how to, that just because I could see something really exciting about this piece, even in an advanced, really good upper division class, sort of throwing open the doors on a conversation is often actually not meeting students where they are. And you're oddly setting them up for failure by asking them to be an interlocutor at a level that they aren't prepared for. And so that disconnect, I think, then was frustrating to me as an instructor, but it made the students feel like I had set them up to fail.
Yeah.
And so thinking through how to pitch questions that are at the right level. I think the other thing that we do is think that discussion or participatory activities can be a way to fill space. I'm going to lecture for 30 minutes, and then we'll do something participatory, and not thinking about how to scaffold out that participation as carefully as we would any other skill set. Which again can feel like giving the students a lot of freedom, which I think we often want to do. But if it's not partnered with that sort of a strong enough structure to experience failure, be able to diagnose why something didn't go well, and then have a chance to do it again, it will just be demoralizing.
Yeah. Well, I like that idea of, this is probably a poor way to describe it, but supervised failure, that the students engage in something that isn't working right away in a safe place to do so, and to realize there's some technique, or you can troubleshoot and still keep moving forward and not bail out on the activity, but actually just get better at doing it.
Right. And I think one of the things that students know when conversations go well and they go poorly, they know what it feels like. I've actually it can be really interesting to have students sort of talk through that question, sort of what does it mean when a conversation goes well? What does it feel like to you? What do you think happens? What is the think back to classes where conversations have gone well. How did that faculty member behave? And they'll have very specific, often contradictory, but very specific things to say as a class about what works and what doesn't. And so then you can, I like to then leverage those pieces and I'm like, okay, great, we're going to try it this way. And then we'll do a debrief. And part of the participatory activity is actually we did the activity and now we're going to talk about what I should have done differently, what you could have done differently, and then we'll incorporate that in the next phase.
Are you explicitly identifying the kinds of interaction that you're cultivating as the learning, that the process is the content in many ways? Or?
It depends on the class, but yes, in a lot of instances. So in an introductory American government course, one of the learning outcomes that I have, and I'm going to misstate this in terms of exact learning outcome language, but is essentially that students learn to put forward a position and defend that position using the appropriate terms of sort of the discipline of political science, as opposed to political punditry. And so for me, the ability to think through a series of analytical claims and offer those up for discussion and dissection by other people, respond appropriately to what's been offered up by colleagues in the classroom, and then everybody shake hands about a political disagreement and walk away. That process is a big part of what I want students to get out of the class. It's a similar, there's the Vote Oswego large participatory class. It's a similar piece. It's a giant group project. It's probably the closest to a practical kind of campaign work experience that students, or a lot of the students that I was working with, were going to get. But that meant that people had real disagreements about strategy, real disagreements about the budget. Somebody got that $100 to spend for their part of the project, which meant somebody else didn't get that $100. And so the ability to work through those experiences and disagreements as a team is absolutely part of the learning of that course.
I'm trying to imagine where students can access good examples of that happening in our larger world. I think it's probably what spooks many of them and many of us is the way conversations can go so wrong in social media or elsewhere, or how they are just too fraught to even step into. Are there examples that, is it all going to be homegrown? Or are there some examples of that kind of interaction?
That's a good question. There are absolutely organizations that are doing really good versions of this work. And I think tons of workplaces would be doing very good versions of this work. I have no experience giving it to students as a model, I would say. That's not something I've really thought about. I think about having them model and get comfortable with the interactions on those easy questions so that those relationships are built and the kind of patterns of how we disagree are built before you move into something that has some higher stakes to it. But it's an interesting, I haven't tried having them sort of like watch or experience a model of it before they participate in it.
Well, I love the idea that their relationships in that room are front and center. And I also think of the well-meaning enthusiasm that we can bring as instructors into a classroom often just serve to reinforce everybody's suspicion that the strongest relationship in the room is between that faculty member and their discipline. And that's tight and clearly rewarding, but it can be hard to imagine breaking into that space once it's created. But if the students are seeing their relationships within the room as being central to the work that they're going to accomplish together, then displace, step outside.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I'm also a person who has a habit there are a couple things I do in upper division classes to try to encourage participation. One of them is I will have assignments that involve me not talking for 30 minutes and I sit on the floor behind the desk, like behind the podium. And so again, it's a very specific sort of, if you're the person who is in charge, usually it's 2 people, here's what you had to produce before class started. You need to have a question set, you come in, I'll do announcements, and then I basically say, okay, great, you're in charge. And then I sit down on the floor behind the podium. Because if I'm physically available, they will look to me to intervene. And I, at some point, don't have enough self-control to just sit there while they all stare at me and not do something. It often will take 5 or so minutes out of their 20 for them to really get going. But if I fully absent myself from them, they'll take it. And they develop very different relationships on the basis of doing that. The other piece I do in classes is I like to have to be determined weeks. So often in advanced classes, there's way more interesting content than you could cover in whatever the advanced class topic is. And so I'll try to leave the 2 weeks before finals as to be determined. And at some point around midterms, the big participatory conversation is, what do you want to put in those weeks? And so students actually have to come with some kind of idea around, we hit on this in week 2 and I want to talk about it more, or rank didn't include this thing and I think she totally should have, and can we talk about, and then they have to vote and sort of have a decision, and then I go and find those readings and get them on the syllabus. And so again, that's a reasonably low stakes conversation for them to have, but it gives them something where they are working collaboratively to make an actual decision that has a legitimate impact on their experience of the rest of the semester.
And the semester culminates in that,
Yes.
sounds like.
Yeah. And so I will
great-
also say you get better participation in those last couple, or at least I do, in those last couple weeks before finals, because the students have said, no, but this is what we want to do.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, since we are recording this during finals week,
Sure.
I should ask, what question should I have asked you that I didn't?
Ooh. This is an
Or if there's
question.
any other bit you'd like to throw into the mix here, from your point of view as faculty, as student, as the director of our new center and aspirations there.
I mean,
You can put in a plug.
Center for Civic Education, 215 Sabin Hall. I really do see, I think it's really easy to think that the Civic Ed Center is here for voter engagement and talking about political issues. And it's not that we're not going to do those things. But I really want to emphasize that my understanding of civics is so much broader than those pieces. And I really think things like how we build participatory cultures in our classrooms and how we increase students' sort of willingness and comfort level participating in our classrooms, that is building a civic culture in those classrooms. It's building a civic culture at UNI, and it can pay dividends for our students. And that is not asking that folks put quote unquote political content into their classes. It's thinking about how in your discipline, what does it mean to engage in a conversation, to engage in a discussion, and building those skills with students through participatory opportunities.
Wonderful. Well, we're so fortunate to have you aboard as a Panther. So thank you for joining us today and
Of
for
course.
joining the UNI community.
Thank you.